and welcome to the Budget Talk with Mr. KV Subramanian. He is the Executive Director of IMF. He was also the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. So let me just begin with my first question. A big booster given by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman today for the middle class. What do you think it will do to the consumption story of India and how it is going to contribute to India's GDP growth?
So Neeraj, you might have actually seen the tweet that I put out explaining the impact of this personal income tax cut on consumption and on GDP growth. Overall, as the Honorable Finance Minister said, the revenue foregone is expected to be 1 lakh crore. That is directly money that is going to be in the hands of the middle class or in the pockets of the middle class. So if we take into account the savings rate for the middle class, I'm using 2023 data. Savings rate has been 18.2%. Let's be a little bit conservative and assume it to be 20% because a higher savings rate means lower consumption. And that is why I'm being conservative. Now, there is this concept of the consumption multiplier, which is basically comes about, when I spend, let's say I go and, the 10,000, suppose if I get an additional 10,000 rupees, I go and buy a smartphone from that. And let's say, you are the person who actually gets that money. You go and buy, let's say, some clothing for you. You spend basically, you save 20% and spend 80% of that. So that's 8,000. The person who gets that 8,000 then spends 80% of that, and like that this chain reaction happens, and that's what basically leads to. So overall, the consumption multiplier will be about 5 times the actual money that has been put in the pocket of the middle class. So that's about 5 lakh crore, which translates into about 4.7% of consumption in real terms, and about 2.7% of GDP. So I do expect, therefore, consumption growth to be in double digits in FY26, and and GDP growth to be closer to be 8%. As a result, because you do remember that 60% of our GDP comes from consumption.
Right. So, Mr. Subramanian, despite the fact that the government is actually not looking at above 7% GDP growth rate for the next financial year, you are hopeful that this consumption boost will push India's GDP to 8% and plus?
Yeah, if you would recall, last year, around this time, on my budget analysis, I had said that the fiscal deficit number will actually be lower than what has been budgeted. That is right. Exactly what has happened. I'd said it's likely to be about 4.8%, and which is what has been delivered. And the reason I said that is because, starting from the 2020 budget, when I was part of the government, the budget numbers are being provided very transparently. Earlier, if you would recall, there used to be these off-balance sheet items, etc., that used to actually, generate a lot of opacity. Also, there's been this practice actually, and I was involved in this as well, of, under-promising and over-delivering on some of these. And I think that's why I do feel that these basically will be achieved.
All right. Mr. Subramanian, one thing that has constantly worried the government is the lack of investment from the private sector. This year's economic survey, last year's economic survey, in fact, the budget previous to that, Finance Minister herself had said that, the government has been doing its job. They have been investing a lot in creating infrastructure. But the private sector capex has been very low all these years. What do you think is the reason, and is there any way to boost capex from the private sector?
So I think the increase in consumption that I've talked about will provide a significant impetus to private investment, because if you ask industry typically has been saying that we're not investing as much because we don't see consumption increasing. But this year, as I said, I expect consumption to actually go up in double digits, and therefore this is the right time for industry to invest. I don't think they would basically have any further reasons to provide. I hope that industry doesn't come back and say, we're now waiting for the monetary policy to also actually ease. I think industry understands very well that you don't live in a perfect world. You actually live in a in the world that is the real world, and therefore they should actually utilize this opportunity of the boost to consumption that will be provided to start stepping up on private investment. So I think the government has done the needful here.
Mr. Subramanian, Economic Survey presented yesterday in its AI chapter has opened up a Pandora's box by talking about the AI tax or the robo tax, which is being discussed in European countries. Could you just explain to our audience that why could there be a need of a robo tax, if at all, and what kind of impact on redistribution of wealth it can do for a modern economy which is relying more and more on AI and robots, and which is likely to take away the jobs as we have seen since the coming of the Industrial Revolution?
Let me correct you here, Neeraj, on, I think the premise of your question needs actually some corrections. You ended by your question by saying that, post the Industrial Revolution, basically, these kind of technologies have been taking away jobs. Absolutely...
No, Mr. Subramanian. Actually, I meant to say that post-Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of jobs, but post-coming of AI, for the first time, there is going to be likely an expected decline in jobs. That's what I meant.
So even if you said that, I think that also is something that needs to be actually set right. If you look at overall every technological change that has happened, it has changed the nature of jobs. It has not reduced jobs in the economy. Was it the case that, the arrival of the internet actually reduced jobs? No, it actually brought a lot more service sector jobs, more software jobs. So that is a fact. I think, AI, especially for a country like India, and I think this is something that industry should look at, for the European economies, for, let's say, the United States, for them to use a lot of mechanized manufacturing is something that actually is optimal for them, because they are a labor short, economy, while India is actually a labor surplus economy. And therefore, it is important for industry to, to basically not shoot itself on its foot, because if for instance they go for more capital intensive growth, that will not lead to the employment creation, and thereby increases in disposable income, and consequently the increase in consumption that they need for growth and for their investment and for their for corporate activity to increase. So I think and this is where industry bodies like CII, FICCI need to play a critical role, because every firm in and itself might actually think about, maybe I can do more capital intensive, but then if every firm, does that, then you actually have not enough, job creation, not enough, consumption thereby. And this is where the coordinating role of, a CII or a FICCI is really critical in setting the agenda for more labor intensive growth in India. I think that's the first point. Second, also I would mention that if you look at the nature of manufacturing as well, India actually is likely to do more manufacturing that is labor intensive, and that is what is our comparative advantage. While the advanced economies, Europe, United States, etc., are far more likely to resort to more capital intensive manufacturing. So on that premise as well, I think the fear of job loss is something that is not very high. From a broader perspective of the impact of AI, I think compared to every other technological change that has come about before, which really impacted the blue collar jobs, AI will have an impact far more on the white collar jobs. And I think that is something that it will change the nature of white collar jobs. But I don't think, it will actually destroy jobs. This is typically fear mongering that gets done by people, who, maybe actually are far too pessimistic about some of these things. I think history tells us that technological change only changes the nature of jobs. It does not really destroy jobs as much.
All right, Mr. Subramanian, there is also a lot of focus on startups in today's budget presented by the finance minister. But there's an AI race going on between China and US, and India is also trying to take its strides to capture this AI wave. Do you think the fund announced for AI R&D to the tune of about rupees 500 crore, would that be enough? Do you think that India needs to generate more resources, especially for deep tech startups that have often said that they find it very difficult to raise funds in India, especially for long gestation research works, due to which they are forced to flip their registration to United States or Singapore or other countries?
So yeah, here you would recall, Neeraj, that the July budget had actually allocated 1 lakh crore for the innovation fund, together with the creation of the ANRF, the equivalent of NSF for India. And if you would recall, this was announced in the 2019 budget, and now the CEO of ANRF also has been appointed, somebody who's a very good researcher who understands AI and deep tech, etc., really very well. So I think the necessary conditions for supporting deep tech and especially startups is something that actually is being ensured. I do think that startups will play a very critical role for India, because it is startups that actually will have to work on solving India's problems at India's scale and at Indian price points. And I think the fund of funds that has been announced by the finance minister, about 20,000 crores, I think will also be a very important element in this endeavor.
One more question, Mr. Subramanian, and my last one for you today. There is also a lot of talk about the brain drain from India. The most talented people are being attracted by other countries like UAE, US, and Singapore, because there is a lot of focus on knowledge economy. What do you think can the government of India do to ensure that the best minds of India do not make for US or any other country, but they stay in India, they make for India, especially in terms of creation of the IP?
I think the most important thing that the government can do is deliver consistently 8% growth, implement policies that delivers 8% growth, because, if the economy is growing at 8% in real terms, it will be growing at about 13.5% in nominal terms, with, taking about 5% inflation. And it is a fact that, for professionals, especially the kind of talent that one is concerned about when brain drain is talked about, salaries typically grow at about, 20-25% more than that of the nominal rate of GDP growth of the economy. So, with 13.5% nominal GDP growth, these professionals can be looking at about 15%, salary growth every year. That translates into, doubling of their salaries every 5 years, using the rule of 72. For a salaried professional, or, for a professional who, let's say, starting his career, and therefore maybe he's in his, early 20s and will work, let's say, till he's 65, 70, that means about 45 years of a career. If basically every 5 years, his salary doubles, that is, nine times doubling, 8 times, 9 times doubling. And very well, 2 to the power 8 is actually 256. So which means, such a professional can look at 250 times, multiplication of his salary, in India, and not just in rupee terms, but in dollar terms as well. And I think that I go back to actually the economics that I've provided in my book, India at 100, on this as well. In contrast, if you take even a country like the United States, where, 5% nominal growth, I think would be something that will be very good, 5, maybe 6%, then salaries can only grow at about 7%, which means salaries will of the same professionals will double every 10 years. And, over a 40 odd year period, that's only four doublings then, which is basically 15, 16 times, So, I mean, I think the professionals can do their arithmetic, using what I've just laid out, that, 250 times salary multiplication over the course of their careers, vis-a-vis, 15 times multiplication. Clearly, the economics, tells you where the opportunities lie. And I think, this illustrates that the opportunities clearly lie in India. That said, though, I think India should work on also in enhancing the quality of life,
Yes, I was about
especially
to
by
come to that.
reducing the reducing travel times. I think in metros travel times actually are large, and that reduces the amount of time that professionals can spend with their families, and that is important. At the same time, also reducing air pollution, water pollution, etc., is also critical to enhance quality of life. So I think this is an area that especially state governments must be, must work on to ensure that the quality of life is actually improved in urban areas. That will really then double up on the economic opportunities that India will provide to professionals in the next several decades.
Mr. Subramanian, do you think that for the quality of life to improve in India, the smart city project must become successful? And while the government has been focusing on creating those kind of smart cities, but still, those smart cities have not come up in the way we had expected 10 years ago.
Look, Neeraj, we actually, I think, seem to put all the onus only on the union government. I think, as things like the quality of life is something that state governments have to deliver. When it comes to travel, for instance, urban travel, right? That is something that is basically the state's responsibility, because eventually it is a municipality, and in India, of course, the municipalities do not have as much, they don't have the fiscal space, nor do they have the power. So it is really the state's chief minister and the state government that actually drives this. So the question about quality of life or the need for improvement in that needs to be asked by the state governments. Actually, people like you need to be asking this of the Delhi chief minister. What has been done? Why is it that the quality of water in Yamuna actually is so poor? And how can you just basically insult the intelligence of Delhi people by saying that it is coming from Haryana, where the data is very clear that is not the case. Or for that matter, actually, in a Tamil Nadu or a Maharashtra, Bombay, any of these cities, actually Bangalore, for instance, the travel times are actually by far the worst in Bengaluru. And I think state governments really need to be pulled up on this, and people like you need to be asking these questions of the state chief ministers. I think the attention that is put on the union government's budget is all well, but equal amount of attention needs to be actually put on the state governments as well. And I don't see people like you actually doing enough on asking these questions of the state governments.
All right, Mr. Subramanian. As always, you put the blame back on the journalists, but we take it in our stride. Thank you very much for talking to us today, and I hope to see you when you are in India.
It is in the spirit of. It is, we policymakers try to do our very best, and actually journalists need to do as well. I think, I'm not saying anything that you would disagree with. This is something that you have to do, and so I'm not really putting any blame. I'm just I'm making you aware of your responsibilities.
Definitely, Mr. Subramanian. So as I said, that I hope to see you when you are next in India. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.